Thank you for standing by, and welcome to the Bun webcast. During today's webcast, attendees will be in listen-only mode. There will be a Q&A session at the end of today's call. If you have a question during the presentation, you may submit it online by entering it into the QA panel. If you're in full screen view, click the question icon located in the floating toolbar at the lower side of your screen. Simply type a question into the dialog box and click the send button. If you're in the split screen mode, the Q&A panel is already open and is located on the lower right side of your screen. As a reminder, this presentation is being recorded. If you are experiencing technical issues, please contact WebEx Technical Support. Our speaker today is Guido Day, Manager Technical Support. Guido, please go ahead.
Hi everybody, my name is Guido. I would like to talk today about the calibration from a Bun Tamp one-step espresso machine. And first of all, thanks for watching. And I think that because you're watching, you probably have a unit somewhere in your facility. And sometimes you have probably the need to do small slight adjustments, and you always don't want to call in for service for that one. The session is recorded, so you don't have to take any screenshots or something like this, and we will send you a link which will be shared with you after that course is done here, and you can always, review that one there and even share it perhaps with coworkers. During the whole session, you can please ask us some questions, and we will answer them at the end from this practical portion here in a Q&A session there as well. So what are we going to do? We are looking at a calibration from mostly around the espresso, because on the milk side we really cannot calibrate it. There are no factors or parameters for an operator to do an adjustment around that one, except perhaps changing a little bit more or less milk in an individual recipe. So we are focusing here solely on the coffee portion, and as a product we are always calibrating on, it is always a double espresso. With this, everybody who touches the equipment knows which product to use, and we always look for a basic calibration for a 14 grams 60 milliliters double espresso with a dispense time somewhere between 18 to 23. This doesn't mean that your recipes are perhaps exactly these recipes. This is just a standard, a default. And you might be running perhaps on recipes where you say my double espresso is just 50 milliliters, but I'm doing it with 60, with 16 grams of coffee, and perhaps I'm running it on 25 seconds. So whatever is individual behind that, we still would use the double espresso. The milk temperature, our target is there 160 degrees plus and minus 2 degrees Celsius. The hotter you're getting the milk temperature there, the flatter and the milk will be getting. You're losing the sweetness from the milk there. The lower you're getting, you're probably getting some feedback from customers that they say, hey, we would like to get it perhaps a little bit warmer. So that's why we are targeting it at 160. The recipes, what you can adjust here, are shown in milliliters for the volume, and they are shown in grams for coffee in regards to weight. So with this one, let's see which parameters we have and what they do. And for this, I'm going into the programming from the equipment. So I'm going to press and hold the Bun logo for 5 seconds. I go into my advanced menu option, and the operator code to get there inside is a 6601. So I'm pressing 6601, and here I am. So if I want to do now my recipes, I go into the recipes for the calibration, and I can calibrate in two ways, or the calibration has two components, perhaps is a better wording. The one is our dispense time for the coffee. The other one is our calibration from the grinder. So we will first talk about the recipe itself, and then after that one we will be talking about the calibration from the grinder. So I said our default recipe is a double espresso. So I go into the espresso times 2, and these are basically currently all the parameters I can change. I have a parameter which is called coffee. That is the amount of coffee going into the brew chamber. 14 grams, so each individual double espresso has 14 grams of coffee in it. The water is the amount which the machine is brewing. If we are sitting here at 60 milliliters, this doesn't always mean that you have 100% exactly 60 milliliters in your cup. You might have sometimes 57, 58, 55, or you might have 65. This is always sometimes a little bit driven by the coffee you're using, the coarseness and the fineness, how much water does the coffee observes. If you really look inside a finished product, you always have to take a shot glass and basically adjust the volume to match your shot glass size there. We have a factor called Americano bypass after. This is used for the Americano. So we are making there first our espresso shot, and then the machine is adding hot water to finish the drink as an Americano. We have a bypass before. The bypass before is basically the opposite. So we are first adding the hot water into the cup, and then the espresso goes into it. This makes the drink appear differently. We don't have as much crema on top of it, and the taste profile is as well slightly different in between these two products there. If you want, you can even make a drink where you say, I do first I do half and half. So that's kind of also possible with bypass after and before. The two other factors what you have is a pre-infusion and a dwell time. They go kind of hand in hand. So the pre-infusion is basically you put the coffee ground into the brew chamber, you're putting some water into the coffee, and you let the coffee pre-extract to get some more flavoring out of it, to extend your brew time with these things. And this milliliters, what you enter there, are always part of the overall water volume in your recipe. And then the dwell time is basically the time where this water is sitting and blooming in the coffee there before then the remainder from the product goes through the coffee. You have a button here on it which is called the default. These defaults are always bun defaults and not your defaults. So be careful with pressing this button because you could lose your individual recipes. With the pre-infusion and the dwell time, I would like to point one thing out. As nice as it is that you have some factors where you can play a little bit more with the flavor around the coffee, whenever you have a pre-infusion in it in a dwell time, in this process, the machine does not activate the water pump while we are infusing the water into the coffee ground. And if for whatever reason your water pressure in a store on site is very, very low, or your coffee ground for whatever reason got too fine, you might get a water flow error on the equipment, which is at that point not necessarily an equipment issue. It is either a supply issue or it is too fine of a grind issue. That could cause perhaps that you have certain drinks without a pre-infusion and a dwell time, and they are always working fine, while other drinks which have the pre-infusion and dwell as part of the recipe, they might error out. So keep that in mind with these two factors, that they have an impact on that error message. This is a portion which I have as an operator to be able to adjust for my coffee portion. An espresso, a double espresso, doesn't have any milk into it. So let's look real quick while we are here in the recipes, which parameters do I have to change for an individual milk recipe. So when we looked into the cappuccino, the recipe screen is exactly the same on the coffee side as the double espresso. But I have an additional button here which is called Milk Setup. And in the Milk Setup, I'm finding now additional values. So the first one is a milk volume, and the second one is a foam volume. So with this you can say, for example, a latte which has more milk and just a small layer of foam, you would put milk into the drink as well as you would be putting foam there inside. On a cappuccino, because that drink is more foam driven than the latte, you see that we have 0 milliliters of milk in it, and we are just doing a foam-based product. The syrup offset is there for mainly used in the self-service environment, that if you're adding flavors, vanilla, caramel, whatever you want in that drink, to the drink, that you can lower your volume in the drink by that amount of milliliters. Yeah, so that the cup does not overfill. Although we find that the idea behind that is a great idea, when it comes into operations, sometimes it confuses an operator which is perhaps not working on the equipment on a daily basis, that they say, you know, a mocha always has chocolate inside, why don't I have to press on a mocha a syrup button while on a vanilla cappuccino I have to do that? So what we normally do is, as well as another option, is that we kind of ignore that button, and we rather program the cup to a filling level that it is full enough when you don't have syrup in it, and it doesn't overflow the cup when you add the syrup to it. The dispense order on this machine is basically, at that point, you define in which order coffee and milk is going into the cup. The most common one is milk and coffee, because at that point both products, coffee and milk, are dispensed at the same time. That's normally your fastest product what you can get out there. If you want to start layering or get, for example, your cappuccino with a brown foam creamer on it and tasting a little bit more coffee forward, then you would do coffee then milk, because then first the espresso portion would be coming in, and then the milk would be adding on top of it, and that would basically bring up a brownish milk foam to the top of the cup. If you want to do some layerings, perhaps in glasses or something like this, or for ice drinks like macchiatos or something like this, you would basically do milk then coffee. So you would first dispense the milk and then get your coffee product into that one to get that layering effect into your cup. That are the parameters what you can do here as a milk part of the recipe. Next to the default recipe, again, Bun default recipes, you can test the milk portion of it. You can test the complete recipe there as well. And whenever you press save and exit, it saves it and it goes back to your previous screen. If you just press a cancel button, you're basically just going back to your previous screen, and all the changes which had been made are no longer in the recipe. So part of the calibration is as well a factor which is called the brew temperature. The brew temperature you find in your machine settings. The brew temperature here is set by default as 195 degrees. And you know, a different brewing temperature has an impact in the taste and appearance of the product. So we find roasters that they say, you know, we always brew our espressos with, you know, perhaps 189 degrees or 200 degrees. And that's just because how they roasted previously their blends. In general, I think you can say that, you know, when you go away from that 195 and you're lowering your temperatures, this normally results in a little bit lighter color from the finished product in the cup, as well that the shots are coming out a little bit faster, and they are coming perhaps a little bit more out on the sour side. If you're increasing the temperature there, that normally perhaps brings you a little bit towards a little bit darker crema in the cup, and you're getting perhaps a little bit harsher, a little bit burnt taste. But again, depending on how the blend is roasted from a roaster, you might be seeing it from the get-go out of that these values are higher or lower. So when we want to do now our shots and we want to look how fast our shots are, we do that in the recipes, because in the recipes we have a timer which exactly shows us how long does it take to make that espresso portion. Again, we always take the double espresso, and let's see how that looks. So I go into the recipe, I take a cup, paper cup here, and I go into my double espresso, and if I now press my test coffee, I'm seeing machine is grinding, it's now temping the coffee, and I'm now seeing here on the shot timer, the shot timer is showing me that number. So if this number is out of your target, is either too fine or too coarse, you can adjust the fineness from the grind. You don't need to have to place a service call for that one there. So this was now a shot time of 22 seconds, which is right in the middle of that target there. If this time would be exceeding 60 seconds, at that point the machine would basically stop the brewing cycle and would at that point do not finish the product. Because we say if a product is already so far past its original target, the taste is off. And again, remember what I said a little bit on the temperatures there. A fast shot is either weak, acid, thin. A long shot, becomes bitter and harsh. So you want to be in that sweet spot where you get all the flavorness and the sweetness out of that coffee in the 18 to 23 seconds there. So this one would be now a fine shot. I wouldn't have to do any adjustments there. But if I have to do that, if I have to do a grind adjustment, I can do that in the equipment. And this is a manual adjustment. So instead of opening the operator door, I'm opening now the service door so that we have a little bit more visibility to what I'm talking about. You see here in the machine, and I point at this one real quick with the brush, you see one adjustment knob here, and you see one adjustment knob there. This adjustment knob is basically the grind adjustment. And the grind adjustment is basically the driver for how fast am I dispensing my product. So the coarser the coffee ground is, the faster the product comes through. The finer the coffee ground is, the slower the product comes through. To keep that in your mind and to remember that one, think about the beautiful summer. You're with your family on the beach, and you have 2 buckets of water, and you're standing on a beach, pure white sand, as white as can be, very fine and everything, and you pour your bucket of water on that sand, and it takes forever for the water to disappear in the sand. And then you're standing suddenly on a gravel beach. A beach is as beautiful as it can be as well, and you pour the water on it there, and the water nearly disappears immediately on that gravel. So that's kind of behind the fineness from coffee ground. The finer the coffee ground it is, the longer it takes for the product to get through it. The coarser the coffee ground is, the faster that one is out there. So you see here on the front of the brew mechanism as well an adjustment which says finer. So if you want to make the left grinder finer, you adjust the grinder to the left. If you do the right grind and you want to make that finer, you do it to the right. Just another thing to remember, to make it finer, the left to the left, the right to the right. When you make that adjustment there, the adjustment might be very sensitive. And the sensitivity comes, you have a window between 18 to 23 seconds. There the adjustment is very sensitive. If you're far outside from that adjustment, you probably have to do a little bit more adjustment to get into the window back there inside. What I would do as a rule of thumb is always do 2 or 3 clicks from an adjustment. Whenever you turn that knob there, you find small little clicks, and you have, for full rotation, you have 12 clicks. So if you do always 2 or 3 clicks, that can lead to a time change of 1 second from an adjustment. What we want to avoid is that you say, oh, I'm currently perhaps at 15 seconds, and now I have to make my grinder finer, and you're suddenly turning that adjustment knob a full round, and suddenly your shot comes out at 35 or 40 seconds, because then you went to the other extreme. You make a grind adjustment, and you need to run at least 2 or 3 drinks to make that adjustment effective into the cup. Because you have a little bit, coffee ground still in the grinder. There's a de-chaffer as well, which has a little bit coffee ground there in it. So all these areas have to be, exchanged with the new grind size. So you always have to run at least 2 or 3 drinks. So let's say you started out at 15 seconds and you do a grind adjustment and you make it, 2 or 3 clicks finer. The next one is you run 3 drinks. The next one suddenly is 16. Then you do a grind adjustment again, 2 or 3 clicks. Oh, it stays at 16 or 17, and then you do the next one, and suddenly you're up at 18. So you always do it, in small little increments to make sure that you're not going to the other side. How often do you have to do that grind adjustment? I think that it always depends a little bit on, your business. The business in this way about, what is the usage on that machine? Are you constantly running shots, or do you have peak business, or do you have an intermittent business there? That affects, how often do you have to do that? It affects as well how do you store the beans and when you put their beans into it. For example, if beans are coming very cold in, when they are cold, they tend to attract some moisture to it, and suddenly the behavior from the bean is different than if the bean is just stored here next to the machine in a sealed bag. So these have effects on that one there. You might as well see that when you are opening a brand new fresh bag of beans, that you might have to do a grind adjustment because the beans are still so oily, and so that this one needs to be done with a new fresh bag of beans. That's kind of a rule of thumb. You probably will recognize it as an operator quicker than anybody else when to do that grind adjustment. I just can say that, that today the shot is running at 19 seconds, tomorrow it's running at 20 seconds, the day after it's running at 18 seconds, and then it's running again at 20 seconds. These are all natural things which are happening out there, and that's why we give the technician and the product the 18 to 23 range right there. Okay. So when we do a calibration about the shot time, that is about how quick the coffee comes out of the dispense tip. The next calibration, what is part of that right dispense time, is a grinder calibration. A grinder calibration is kind of, very important. First of all, when do we have to do a grinder calibration? So a grinder calibration has to be done period whenever you change the roast, because every roast is different. And when you have a darker or a lighter roast, the grinder performance is different. So you're suddenly getting more or less coffee into your ground, into your brew mechanism. And at that point, you have a very huge impact in your taste by just switching the beans. There might be sometimes beans which are so close to each other how they are roasted that it doesn't have a huge impact in the performance from the grinder. But in general, what we recommend is as soon as you switch to a different bean, you have to do a grinder catch test. As well, what we say is whenever you do an adjustment from the fineness from the ground, which is more than one full rotation, you should be doing a grinder catch test. Because what's basically happening is at that point, when you make your coffee ground finer, the volume from the particles, because the particles are much smaller, are less in the brew chamber. And at that point, you don't get suddenly perhaps your 14 grams there inside, you're only suddenly getting your 13.5 grams in the brew chamber. If you only get your 13.5 grams into the brew chamber, you might be seeing that suddenly your taste is weaker than what you would have expected. When you do a grinder calibration, because we have two grinders, a left and a right one, you always have to remember that you have to do both calibrations on both sides. The grinder settings, they are accessible by the operator with the code 6601, and that's where you can do the grinder calibration. So what I would like to do is I would like to do one grinder calibration here together with you so that you have seen the routine there and that you can always go back into this video and do if needed on your own. I put very fresh beans in earlier before I started the whole session, so I don't have to worry about that one. It also doesn't make sense to say, oh, I have all beans and I do my calibration from the shot time and from the grinder calibration with that old beans, because as soon as you put fresh, oily beans in there, suddenly all your shot times will be much, much too long. So you rather always say, hey, I take my old beans away and I start with a fresh bag. And at that point, you know that you calibrate on when you open the next bag, what you put in again. So let's start. So let's do one thing. We press and hold the bun logo. Okay. We go into advanced menu options. The passcode was 6601. And then we go into the grinder settings. So the grinder settings, you currently see that you have a left and a right grinder. And again, you have to always do them individually. And let's focus on the right one here. And let's do a calibrate from the right. So the machine tells you immediately on the screen basically what to do. You perform a catch test, you do it 3 times, and then you enter the average weight out of these 3 grind adjustments, or not adjustments, from these 3 grinds. So what you need is basically, you need a scale. Don't use the scale where you step on the mornings, because you have to put decimals behind it. So because we are looking at perhaps 14.7 grams or something like this. So keep that in mind that you do that. Sometimes people have a little bit bigger scales where they can put as well a complete puck drawer on it. I have a very small, tiny scale here. So what I do is always I put my cup on it, I turn my scale on, I tear it out. I empty this, and this is very important, I empty my puck drawer. I take a little bit the brush here to make sure that I have everything what is loose out in the trash. And I put my puck drawer in. Okay. So now I press start a catch test. The machine is grinding, and every time the machine is now grinding, it is basically grinding for 3.5 seconds. That's the baseline there. So it says down here status done 1, so I did it once. And I do a second one, because remember we wanted to do 3 of these catch tests there. So this is number 2. It grinded again for 3.5 seconds. And now I'm doing my third one. Okay. So after this one is done, I always open the brew chamber. I make sure that I have all the coffee which is out there in the drawer. I take now my drawer out, and I basically take this and put it into the cup, and I scale it now. So my scale says I have 45.9 grams of coffee. Because I have 3 weights, this is now a throw rate of 15.3. Okay, so I can now press enter results, and I'm now entering 15.3 as a throw rate. Okay, so now the machine knows the next time you're making a drink how long the grinder is running, or how long the grinder has to run to put the correct amount of coffee into the brew chamber. If this calibration is off, all your other products are off, all the taste profiles are off, because at that point the machine either puts too much or not enough coffee into the brew chamber. At this point now, because I entered my values there, I press save and exit, and that's how the machine stored the information. What are things which can go wrong in this whole calibration? So the first one is that people enter 45.9 grams instead of dividing it by 3. At that point, you would get just a very tiny little bit of coffee into the brew chamber, and at that point everything is off there. So always remember, when you do the catch test of 3, divide it by 3. And make the 3, because there's always a slightly little bit tolerance in between these row when the grinders are running. And we saw another point underneath of that one here, which is a 14 gram dry pack. This 14 gram dry pack, now the machine is basically grinding based on my catch test that I have 14 grams here in the brew chamber. So I did this. I'll put this back on. I clean my coffee ground here. Make sure that it's going into the brew chamber. So, and I have a weight of 14.2 grams, which is perfectly fine, because you always have to allow a little bit tolerance to the left of the right. So if you, whenever you do that, and when you run a 14 gram shot, whenever you're between 13.7, 14.3, whenever you're in that window, you did an excellent way of calibrating the equipment there. How frequently do I have to do that? Again, as a bare minimum, whenever I do the switch from one bean to another bean. A technician, whenever he comes out to perform a PM, part of the PM is to ensure that the grinder calibration is done. And the third one is, if you're doing a huge grind adjustment, you're changing the volume in the brew chamber with this one, and you want to correct that one. So the grind adjustment goes a little bit in hand with the grinder calibration. Okay. So That was a successful one there, so I'm saving it and exiting it. We talked about the tools and how often we do that here. And we also said earlier that you have no way to calibrate milk. In regards to the milk calibration, I would perhaps do one thing. Again, the machine can only do dairy product. If you're using a machine which is a non-dairy milk as a secondary milk, you might see volume issues out there. So that's kind of what we know and experienced out there. If you have all milk drinks underfilling, always run a cleaning cycle and see if that one fixes it. If this doesn't fix it, it's probably something where a technician has to look after it. If you only have one milk drink which is out of a correct filling level, that is normally an indication about that the recipe for that individual drink is off. So you can fix that. We talked about that earlier. If you go into the recipe from that individual drink, remember when it's a milk drink, you have multiple sizes, so you always have to select the correct size to make sure that you get it there. If you have something with iced drinks, iced lattes, iced mochas or something like this, and you have an underfilling there, always ask yourself the question first, did the person put the right amount of ice into it? Because that's sometimes as well just an operational opportunity there, that the person missed, a couple of ice cubicles there, and suddenly the drink is not to the required filling level there. So that's all about calibration. Again, a certain portion is something like the grinder calibration in regards to the fineness is something what an operator has to do frequently on the equipment. And the grinder calibration is kind of basically something like a new bean, a new setup, or after a while there's just a wear and tear on the grinder burrs and they're not as sharp anymore. So you see a frequent change there, but that doesn't have to be done as often as a manual grind adjustment. So I would now like to open the round for questions, and I hope you enjoyed and took some information out of this session here. Have a good day. So I hope you enjoyed the time there we had during the session. We had a question about how often should I run a grinder to make the change effective going into the brew chamber. So it's always depending on the size of the product you're running. I would always say between 2 or 3. If you're running perhaps 18-gram products, the grinder's running longer, so it's more likely that you get your old non-adjusted product out of the grinder faster. Or if you're running just perhaps single espressos, which are normally between 8 and 12 grams, I would probably run it 3 times. So that's kind of what you see. The first one always disregard. The second one should show you a little bit adjustment there, and then the third one is what you normally should say. Yeah, that's what it is. When you look at times, always remember that is a target. So you can run perhaps 2 drinks in a row and they are both at 22 seconds, and then suddenly the next one is at 24 seconds, and then the next ones are again at 22 seconds, and then you find suddenly one which is running perhaps at 20 seconds. So you always have here and there these small little kind of outliers, but you should always try to target the majority of the drinks at whatever your target is there. Any other questions coming from this session around the calibration from the equipment there? So if there are no any further questions, I would really say thank you very much for taking the time and listening to this one. We have a couple of more still coming up around cleaning and as well troubleshooting. So hope to see you there soon. Other than that, enjoy the weekend, stay safe in these days. Have a good time.